In this case study, we'll be investigating the impact of influent loading dynamics on our simulation results. We'll start by identifying modeling objectives, just like we did in the first case study, because a proper understanding of our modeling objectives is so important to doing a proper modeling job. We'll then look hands-on at how we do the nitty-gritty work of importing data from an Excel spreadsheet into our simulation software. So importing influent flow and loading dynamic inputs. Then we will run the model and generate results. In a second part B, we will look at comparing the results of hourly and daily dynamic loading patterns. So first, the objective. What we're trying to do, first of all, is just understand the impact of loading dynamics on effluent treatment performance. With that understanding and with the insights we gain into the performance, we're then going to identify strategies for improving the treatment performance. So the objective is first to understand and then to identify treatment improvement strategies. We're going to do this using Sumo. And here you can see the flow sheet that we developed in the first case study. So with that, what we'll do is we'll toggle over to Sumo. So here's the Sumo flow sheet that we developed in the first case study. And you can see the 3-pass system consisting of zone 1-1 and zone 1-2 as the first pass, the second pass, and the third pass, in which we've specified the volume, depth, and airflow for every one of the zones. And you recall that each one of the zones was identical except for the aeration, because the aeration was higher because of the higher diffuser density in the first pass, where we see 30,000 cubic meters per day, the second pass, where we see 20,000 cubic meters per day, and the third pass, where we're blowing the equivalent of 10,000 cubic meters per day. Additionally, in our influent, we specified the flow rate, 11,850 cubic meters per day, the COD concentration, 580 grams of COD per meter cubed per day, the TKN, 54, and the total phosphorus, 7.5. And we specified these as constant values because under steady state conditions, all inputs to the model are assumed to be constant. Moreover, you'll see that this table features under a section highlighted as constant in the Sumo process simulator. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at importing these flow and loading characteristics, but in a dynamic table. And so this dynamic table we're going to paste into this section of the Sumo simulator using data that we're going to get from Excel. So with that, we'll move over to Excel. Okay, so here's the data that we've received, and we've been told that this is data that represents the flow profile over a year from our site, as well as the COD, TKN, and phosphorus concentrations. So it's all there, and it's nicely set up for us, and we just need to highlight this data set and copy it to the clipboard and paste it into Sumo. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of validation of the data set. Already we can see it visually, we can see what the patterns are here in these time charts, but I also want to look at some of the statistics. And notably, I want to look at the averages. So we'll do that here. And I'm just going to put in some functions here to calculate the average for our data sets. And so I can see here that my average flow is 11,850 meters cubed per day, exactly the value that we used in our steady state simulations. And our concentration is 580 grams per meter cubed, also the same. TKN is 54 and TP is 7.5. So these concentrations match exactly the values that we used in our steady state simulation. However, as we mentioned in a previous presentation, we're not interested in matching the concentrations between between dynamic and steady state simulations so much as the loading. So that's what we're going to verify right now. We're going to calculate the loads and make sure we have a load equivalency between our steady state simulations and our dynamic simulations. So I'll do that right here. So just adding a few columns. And we are going to calculate now the kilograms per day of COD, TKN, and TP. And so the equation for that is simply going to be the COD concentration times the flow divided by 1,000. And TKN is going to be the same, times the flow divided by 1,000. And for TP, it is going to be also concentration times flow divided by 1,000. And so I can copy these equations down, and I get the loading on a daily basis. And I can calculate the averages for these loadings, and there they are. Now what I want to do is I want to compare these average loads that I'm getting ready to import into Sumo and make sure they match the steady state loads. So the steady state loads are going to be, well, for COD it's going to be the flow, 11,850, times the steady state concentration of COD of 580 divided by 1,000. And lo and behold, the numbers don't quite match. So 6,873 versus 6,762. And so I'm going to make an adjustment in a moment to make sure that these loading values are matching. So similarly here, the number is going to be 54 times 11,850 divided by 1,000. And we can see another discrepancy. And this one, 7.5 times 11,850 divided by 1,000. And there we are. So what we're going to do is we are going to revise these concentrations and prorate them so that our loadings match. So I'll create another few columns here. There we go. And this time we're going to calculate concentrations. And we are going to prorate our concentrations times this divided by this. And I think I need to put some dollar symbols there. There we go. And because we've put the dollar symbols there, I think I can just copy those across. And the equations have the correct references. That's right. So now I will copy these equations down. And now I'm going to copy this data into my original table and paste just the values. So if I do a paste special here, I can paste just the values. And now you can see that I'm getting a perfect correspondence between the loading, the average loading from my dynamic input, 6,873, and the loading that I used in my steady state simulation. So I can copy this data now to my clipboard, and I can toggle over to Sumo, and I can paste my data into Sumo. All right, I think I'm going to give that table a name, and I will call it daily flow loading pattern. And there we go. Now I can simulate dynamically my model. But before that, I want to include some time series plots here in my album so that I can visualize the results. So the first thing I'm going to do is maybe, well, I'll add a few time charts there. And the first one, maybe I just want to plot what the influent flow is and verify that I'm actually simulating the variability that I think I am. And I'll also put in my influent COD and my influent TKN. And then of course I'm interested in looking at the effluent ammonia. And maybe I'm also interested in looking at the DO in my bioreactor. So influent flow. I'll get that one. And influent COD. There that one is. Influent TKN. And effluent ammonia. Oh, I didn't want that there. I wanted that here. And then DO. Well, DO I can get it anywhere in my bioreactor, but let's say I'm interested primarily at looking at my DO right at the back end of the bioreactor. So that's an operational parameter that I can find right here. So I'll simulate my model, and I'll simulate it for 335 days because that's how much data I have, and I'll simulate it at a data interval of, let's say, 1 day. And we'll simulate it from steady state. Okay, so it's looking for steady state right now, and I can verify that well, it looks like my TSS, my suspended solids across the zone, is still on the order of about 3,000 milligrams per liter. And I see some of the other parameters that I tracked in the first case study. I can see my OTE profile, my airflow profile, my DO profile, and my actual oxygen requirement profile. And now here I can see my dynamics, and indeed the data that I imported is appearing here in the chart. So there is my dynamically varying influent flow, and here's my dynamically varying influent COD concentration. My dynamically varying influent TKN, and okay, now here's my simulated effluent quality, and now I can see that my effluent ammonia, whereas under a lot of conditions we are at our concentration of 0.11, 0.15 grams per meter cubed, we are getting a lot of instances of breakthrough or peaks of effluent ammonia. So here I can see a peak, for example, of 8.1 milligrams per liter. And there's maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 peaks that I can see in a 335-day period. So 14 days out of 335. So you can calculate for yourself 14 out of 335. What percent of the time are we getting breakthrough of ammonia into the effluent? The other thing that's interesting to look at here is to look at our DO profile and to see what's going on with DO. And so we see here in the second half of the year, our DO coming out of the zone 3-2 is around 2 milligrams per liter, or even higher in some cases, around 4.5. But the beginning part of the year, it's often, I would say, on average, less than 1 milligram per liter. So we're deficient in oxygen for a good portion of the first half of the year. If we look on average, the average DO is actually 1.89, which doesn't sound so bad until we look at these periods where we see, several days in a row, for example, here where we're well below 0.5 milligram per liter on oxygen. So looking at these dynamics here, maybe pointing out some things that are not so great, not so suboptimal, shall we say, about our process. So at this point, something that makes sense to do is to document our results. And so what we're going to do is we're going to generate a report. So in Sumo, you have this reporting feature here where you can generate a report. And case study 2, yeah, that's a good name. And we'll just say that this is the daily flow and loading pattern. And so we save those results there. And it's generated the report. Do we want to open it? No, not for now. So the other thing we can look at here now is not just the influence of a dynamically varying influent low flow and loading pattern, but the other dynamically varying data we had, which was the temperature and then the fraction of the influent TKN that's ammonia. And so we'll vary those now. So we have these results. We see what they look like. We counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 peaks in effluent ammonia. And now we're going to generate another simulation using another dynamic input. So if I go back to my Excel, I have another table of data that we can import into our Sumo model. And so this one is going to be daily averages of temperature and fractions. And so we have here for our time in days, we have varying temperatures, which we can see here, which vary from 15 up to 25 degrees Celsius. And then fractions of the fraction of ammonia in the TKN, which we can see here is varying from about 50% to maybe 75 or even 80%. And so I'm going to highlight this table now, and I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, and I'm going to go into Sumo and back into my dynamics, and I'm also going to paste this table from the clipboard. And so there the data appears, and I'm going to call this temperature pattern and fraction, and we'll call it SNH fraction. Temperature pattern and SNH fraction. And now I can go and I will rerun another simulation now and see what the influence is of this new dynamic input on my simulated effluent ammonia. So steady state start. And while that's simulating, we'll take a look at some of the other parameters. So dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen on average so far, I get that, on average is actually 4 milligrams per liter. So the average number is fairly high, but we get these periods where we get a sag in the DO to less than half a milligram per liter, which is suboptimal for our nitrification performance. And if we look at our DO profile, similar to what it looked like before. And if we look at our oxygen transfer efficiency, varying from 14% down to less than 10%. Okay, so I think we can start to count the peaks. I count 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So actually less peaks in this case, depending on whether you consider some of these smaller ones a peak. So to me, changing from a constant temperature of 20 degrees Celsius to a varying temperature between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius didn't have a lot of influence on my simulation results. Similarly, changing the fraction of the influent TKN, that is ammonia, doesn't seem to have influenced my simulation results to a great degree. At this point, I will also generate a report, and I'll add in there plus temperature and ammonia fraction. And we will have those results to do some analysis with later. So our simulation results for the two scenarios we investigated are saved here in our folder along with our file for our sumo model. So we can see here the scenario in which we varied both the daily flow and loading patterns, as well as the scenario in which we varied the daily flow and loading patterns, as well as the temperature and the fraction of the influent TKN, that is ammonia. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take the data from these files and we're going to assess them, analyze them, and visualize them. So for that, I did that on the side using some Python visualization scripts, and the results are shown here in this chart. So you can see here what I've done is I've plotted in blue the simulation results where we varied flow and loading dynamics, and then in orange the simulation results where we've plotted flow, load, temperature, and ammonia fraction dynamics. And this is often the first place where you would start. You would just plot the results from one simulation overlaid with the results from another simulation. However, in a lot of cases, this is not the best way to visualize the differences. A lot of the differences are probably masked by the fact that we can't necessarily see the blue line very well because the orange line is overlaying it. So we need another approach. And that's what I have done over here. So I've taken the same data here over on the left, and it's been replotted in terms of a cumulative probability distribution. And so on the right-hand side, what you see is for different effluent concentrations of ammonia on the x-axis, you can see the cumulative probability that we would exceed that effluent ammonia concentration. And so, for example, over here, if we're talking about what is the probability of having an effluent ammonia concentration of between 4 and 6 milligrams per liter, well, for both simulations, it's about the same probability. Both the blue and the orange line show that effluent ammonia is likely to be less than 5 milligrams per liter 95% of the time. So that lines up with 0.8, 0.9, 0.95, 95, the 95th percentile. On the other hand, if we're looking at the probability that effluent ammonia would be less than 1 milligram per liter, now we see some daylight between the blue and the orange curves. And so for the blue curve, where we only simulated flow and loading dynamics in the influent, we are expecting, based on simulation results, to meet 1 milligram per liter 93% of the time. On the other hand, if we look at the orange curve, where we varied not only the flow and the load, but also the influent temperature and the influent ammonia fraction, that is to say the fraction of the influent TKN load that is comprised of ammonia, then we only meet the effluent ammonia criteria of 1 milligram per liter at the 91st percentile. So a difference of 2%. So slightly higher exceedances in this orange simulation result. These cumulative probability distributions provide a basis for understanding percent exceedances. So what percent of the time are we above some threshold value? What threshold value we assign as being important really depends on our effluent compliance limits for our particular case. And the differences we see here in this case may or may not be significant depending on how effluent compliance is regulated. Are we being regulated at the 95th percentile, at the 50th percentile, or some other basis? So we've looked at the effects of varying influent dynamics for flow and load, as well as temperature and the fraction of the TKN in the influent that is comprised of ammonia. And we've seen the differences that that has on our predictions of effluent ammonia. We've also simulated our DO in the last tank, in the last zone of our bioreactor, and observed that our DO is probably suboptimal for about the first half of the year. And this might be related to a lot of the peaks or the exceedances that we see in the effluent during that portion of the year. So what I'd like to try now is just to see if we can use the model to evaluate the benefit of if we increased blower capacity, if we were able to blow more air into the process. Would that help with some of these peaks that we're seeing at the beginning half of the year? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a scenario in which we take these airflows into the different zones and we vary them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check these boxes here, and I'm just going to add these airflows into my scenario manager. And when I go to simulate now, what I can do is I can vary these for my default scenario, or for another scenario in which I'm going to call increased capacity. So in my increased capacity scenario, I'm going to increase these airflows by, let's say 50%. So 30,000 is going to become 45,000. And 20,000 is going to become 30,000. And 10,000 is going to become 15,000. And now I'm going to rerun my simulation. So my airflow profile is still tapered, but I'm running at a higher airflow. And my dissolved oxygen still reflects the fact that I have a higher demand at the front end of the process, and so despite the fact that I'm blowing more air there, I have a depressed DO a lot of the time. But in my second and third pass, my DO is comfortably in the range of 1.5 to 2 milligrams per liter. If I look at my dynamics around DO, I can see that my DO sag periods where I get below 0.5 milligram per liter are very rare. Maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 events over the first half of the year. And then as we can see here, as we get into the second half of the year, we're probably never going to get into a case where we have DO sag less than 0.5 milligram per liter. And we will see then what is the impact of this then on our effluent ammonia. Are we able to eliminate our exceedances? And in fact, yes, we are. So we still have this exceedance here, and this exceedance here, and then this final one here over around day 268. But if I count them, really I would only count 1, 2, or 3 significant peaks. And that compares to the 14 we initially saw in our first simulation. So with that, maybe we can export this data and compare the statistics of this. So we will call this daily flow and loading pattern, temperature and ammonia fractions, and higher Q air. And we will export that data and we will visualize the results. So here we see the simulation results that we've generated in the model with the higher airflows, and we're comparing them now with the results where we varied the flow, the load, the temperature, and the influent ammonia fraction. So both on the left-hand side, we can see already that the orange line, really the peaks are there, but they're a lot less frequent and they don't peak as high. So that so much is obvious just by even an inspection of overlaying one data set with the other. On the right-hand side, we see even more detail. For example, we can see that if you increase the blower capacity, then the orange line, we're able to meet 1 milligram per liter here on the x-axis at about the 99th percentile, which is significantly better on a statistical basis when you compare with the frequency or the statistical frequency at which we're able to meet 1 milligram per liter in the baseline scenario, that is to say the blue line. So a significant improvement. So overall then we conclude that if you increase the blower capacity, you can significantly improve treatment performance at the 90th percentile, so the y-axis of around 90 and above. It's interesting to note, however, that if your compliance criteria is the 50th percentile down here, then there's no real difference between the two simulation results. So the basis on which your compliance is being enforced makes a difference. As our next steps, in Part B, we will compare results using diurnal inputs, that is to say when we're varying the Influent inputs on an hourly basis, with the results that we've already generated using daily varying inputs. In addition, we'll look at simulating a dewatering reject return stream and see how that impacts our treatment performance. Thank you.